Welcome to this important, very important, meaningful program. Our speaker, Ms. Radziner, has been speaking to schools and to the public throughout Burbank and Glendale and Los Angeles for over 10 years. And now you are going to be witnesses to the Holocaust. Without further ado, our speaker, Ms. Lea Radziner.
Hello, students. My name is Lea Radziner, and I'm a survivor of the Holocaust. And I'm very pleased that you all are here to listen to my story. Maybe some of you have read and learned something about the Holocaust, and maybe you've learned about Anne Frank. Anne Frank lived during the war years in Amsterdam, the Netherlands, and that's where I was born. I was born in Amsterdam the day during the Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was a day in Germany when suddenly things became very bad, and the Nazis broke the glasses of store windows and synagogues and set fires in Germany. Now, I was born in Holland. My parents were both immigrants from Poland, from the city of Lodz. My father had gotten there had left Poland sometime in the late 20s. And he was a tailor, and he started doing better after a while. It was hard. And then, just like your parents do, you're an immigrant, it's difficult in the beginning. So, but then when he started doing better, he went back to his country, which was Poland, to look for a wife. Because of course, by that time, he knew how to speak Dutch, which is the language they speak in the Netherlands. But he would prefer someone that came from the same background as he did. And while he was there, he met my mother, and this was in the mid-30s, probably 36, 37. They met, and my mother was an orphan. She had lost her father and mother and lived alone in Poland. And just like in the United States, during the 30s and the 20s was a very difficult time in Europe and the Netherlands and Poland, because there was a depression going on. It was just ending by the mid-30s. So they met, and my father asked her if she wanted to come to Holland and marry him. And when I say Holland, Holland and the Netherlands is the same thing. And she was delighted to come because things were very difficult in Poland. So in about 36, 37, she came to the Netherlands. They got married, and I was born in 1938, November 10, 1938. Like I said, that was the Kristallnacht, when the Nazis showed their true colors. In Holland, things were life was good. They had never had any anti-Semitism. There had been Jews living in the Netherlands for many, many years. And there were Jewish neighborhoods in different cities. Like I said, I came from Amsterdam. And but they were not gated, that you couldn't come in and out. You were totally free to do whatever you wanted. And during World War I in the Netherlands had remained neutral. So there were a lot of refugees that came from Germany or Poland or other countries that came to the Netherlands. And they were sure, or they hoped, that the Netherlands would stay neutral like they had done during World War I. Now, I was born in 38, and they lived in a neighborhood in town. It was not per se a Jewish neighborhood. Like I said, Jews lived all over. Also, let me tell you that Jews looked different, especially in those days, because Dutch people are more blonde. And if you study some history of Holland, in the north of Holland, for some reason, people were even more blonde than in the south of the country. So then I had a little sister that was born in January 8, 1941. The war started in Holland in 1940. We already knew who Hitler was and what his rules were. We had hoped, of course, like I said before, that the Netherlands, that Holland would not be in the war, but the Germans came in and they bombed the city of Rotterdam. And in 4 or 5 days, the war was ended, because the Dutch were not prepared for the might of the Germans. But in the beginning, things went, there was really no difference. We lived in an apartment, and downstairs of the apartment, this is a picture of my parents and the store we had. They had a store that was in the city. It was an apartment building. The store was downstairs, and we lived upstairs. And it was a store where he was a tailor, and he would make suits to order, so people would just come in from the street. In those days, you didn't have all the stores that had ready-made clothing, so you did go to tailors. And he would measure you. My father by that time had help at the store. And he would measure, and then you would choose your fabric, and he would make the suit, and that was the business. So that proceeded like that. And then the war started in 1940. My sister was born in 41. And one day, a few weeks after my sister was born, my father, it was on a Sunday, my father said to my mother, "Look, I have to go into the city to buy some supplies for the store. I'll be back for lunchtime." And he left. And my mother, there was nothing unusual, nothing had happened. The city was calm. But what we didn't know is that there had already been problems between the Germans, the Nazis, and the Dutch sympathizers of the Nazis. And they had some rallies, and there were some Jewish youth that were protesting, and they didn't know it, but the Nazis had planned a rally, and they said, "You know what, we're going to stop this." So at a certain time on that Sunday morning, when my father happened to be in the Jewish section, even though I said it was open, but an area where more Jews than normal lived. And in the Netherlands, I want you to know that during those days in Amsterdam, in all of Holland, there lived about 147,000 Jews. Out of those, in the end, 107,000 were killed. It was the biggest amount of Jews that were killed in Western Europe, was in the Netherlands. So my father went, and he didn't know it. But if you know Amsterdam with its bridges, drawbridges and canals, the Germans had figured it out, and the police and the sympathizers were all ready for them. And they raised the bridges. So you really, normally, the reason they had bridges and canals, because ships or boats would go through them. But when they raise the bridge, you have to wait for them to close it, to leave. Suddenly, all those bridges they opened, the roads were closed, the bridges went up and you couldn't leave, and all these soldiers and Nazis appeared and started catching all the Jews they could find. They had planned to find about 400 plus Jews, young men between the ages of 18 and 35. And my father was in that age group. And they caught the men, and they were all arrested, put on a truck and taken to a place outside of Amsterdam. My mother, meanwhile, was at home waiting for her husband to return and to have lunch, but he didn't appear, and she didn't know what had happened. And it was only a few hours later that the city started talking, and they found out what had happened, that all these men were arrested. And then, of course, the wives went to the police and said what happened, and they got all kind of lies. But the men were taken to this camp. We found that out later. They stayed there a few days, and then they were sent to another camp. They were taken to Germany, to Buchenwald, and from there they were taken to another camp in Austria called Mauthausen. In Buchenwald, 2 of the men were able to escape, or they hid. There were people there. They were in a holding place, and 2 of the men were able to escape. Someone saved them, and they returned. So that's why we know a little bit. The men that ultimately went to Mauthausen were eventually all killed. So basically, from those 400 men that left for Germany and Austria, they were all killed, except for those 2 men, and that's why we know a little bit. My mother, meanwhile, was waiting and waiting, and it was only later that she heard the true story. And yeah, there was nothing she could, of course, they went to the Germans, and the Germans said, oh, this is nothing, they'll be back. And then later on, when they found out where they went, eventually in around a year, they all got notification. One died of a heart attack, the other man died of pneumonia. They were all lies, because since then they've done some research and we found out exactly what happened with these men, and it was not pretty. So my mother was left at home in Amsterdam with her 2 girls and a store, and we had a housekeeper. So my mother was very resourceful, and she asked the housekeeper she took care of us, and my mother went downstairs and kept the store going. Meanwhile, the rules and regulations in Amsterdam became tougher, and people started arresting Jews. They first started by telling Jews, we don't want you to live here in Holland, but if you go on the train and you bring your things, we will see to it that you go to countries in the East, and we'll give you land and you can resettle there. And some of the people believed it. They did go to the train station with their backpacks, said goodbye to their families, but they never returned. Now, my mother, as time in the beginning, like I said, it was not so bad, but the rules became harder and harder. Jews were not allowed to go to the same schools, the children. They had to wear a Star of David. They couldn't take buses. They couldn't have a bicycle, lots of rules. And my mother saw that it was not good. And my father had a brother there in the Netherlands, and they discussed it. And my mother didn't see that this was going to end well. Remember, the Dutch people that were born in Holland, they had more confidence that what they were told was truth. But my mother, who came from Poland already and had seen what anti-Semitic rules can be like, didn't believe it, and they were not so optimistic. So she made a plan. she decided, and I didn't tell you that both my sister and myself, we looked super Jewish, which meant we had Jewish features. We both had dark hair. And like I said, most of the Dutch people were blonde and didn't look like that. So you really, if I was playing outside or if people would see me, even though I never told them anything, just by looking at me, they could tell that I was Jewish, believe it or not. So my mother decided that if she stayed there, then she would be getting, because by that time you were receiving notification to come to a certain theater in Amsterdam, which was like a holding area where they wanted the Jews to come. And from there, you might stay there about a week or so. And then from there, you were sent by train, supposedly to these special places where you could live, but what nobody believed because no one ever came back from those places during that time. And my mother didn't want to do that. So she thought about it, talked to others, and decided that she did not want to do it. But she also did not think that with my sister and myself looking the way we looked. By then, my sister was about 1 year old. I was about 3 years old. They decided that if my mom, first of all, to travel with a baby to try, or two babies, and try to escape was going to be very difficult because you had to take trains and walk. And people just by looking at us, they would know, oh, this woman is a Jew because she has Jewish children. But she herself was sort of blonde, didn't look like us. And also you can, of course, bleach your hair and make yourself look even less dark hair and Jewish looking. So she asked the housekeeper if she would take my sister with her to her house and take care of her. And we also had my uncle and aunt who for some reason were allowed to be there. And she asked, could I stay with them? And they said, sure. And my mother, and believe me, it wasn't easy, but my mother first went by bicycle to the south of Holland, to the border with Belgium. First time it didn't work, but she didn't give up and she did it again. And then from Belgium, she escaped to France. And from France, she went to an eastern city of France called Lyon. And from there, she went up the mountains like you would do here in California. If you come from Mexico, you hire a coyote. There they had some kind of coyotes, but that would take the people up the mountains into Switzerland. Switzerland at that time was a neutral country. And if they allowed you into the country, into Switzerland, you were free and you could stay there. No one at that time, when my mother asked the housekeeper or my aunt to take care of us children, no one believed that it would take that long and that we would actually be there so long and that the war would go on and on. But that's how it was. So I ended up going to my aunt, and I was very happy there because I knew them and I had cousins there, and my sister was the housekeeper. But after a little while, and I had dark hair, remember, I looked Jewish, so I would be playing on the street with neighbors. And of course, those children could see the same thing, that here were this Jewish child playing with them, and they started calling me a dirty Jew. And that went on, and I would go into the house of my aunt and said, oh, so-and-so called me names. And my aunt started to think, well, this doesn't seem safe. Sooner or later, the authorities will find out and they'll pick her up, because by then, all Jews were not allowed to be free and were being picked up, taken to that theater, then put on a train, and they went to concentration camps, which of course we didn't know at that time. That's how it turned out to be. So my aunt decided to find an organization. She belonged to the same organization that was an organization of resistance people. Now, in the Netherlands, you had your bystanders. Those were the regular people that just went on with their life and they didn't want to get involved. Then you had the people that were helping the Germans. They were a kind of a Dutch Nazis. And you had the upstanding citizens. And I hope that you guys will learn something, that to be an upstander and to help people is a good thing. So my aunt found an organization of resistance workers that was taking, this was all illegal, but they did it anyway. And they found places where people decided they would take either adult or children illegally, keep them in their house till it was safe. So she found a place for me and I went there, and there were lots of other children, and I was there for a little while. But after, there were like, I was the youngest of a bunch of children that lived in that home. But as luck would have it, they found out, because also at that time, people were looking for Jews, because if you told authorities that you knew where a Jew was, you might receive special money to pay food, maybe bread or eggs or meat. So when you're hungry, or if you're desperate, you'll do anything, and maybe even without that. So they found out that the next day, all these children were going to be picked up, but the underground people that were the resistance workers also found out. So the night before they were going to come to take us all away, they took each one of us and brought us to a new home. And I don't remember this part that I'm going to tell you. It's only what I've been told. So I was at one house, and then another house. People would say, okay, I'll take a child for a day or two. And then they wanted you to go away. So I went to different homes, and we don't know exactly how or what happened, but we only have certain ideas. Eventually, this is the part where I remember. I was in a train. It was a train I was in a compartment on a train with 2 adults and a bunch of children going to the south. Now the underground, the people, those upstanding citizens were doing a lot of work. And they discovered that in the north of Holland, people were very blonde. And in the south of the country, they were more dark haired. So they decided to send the light children, the blonde children, to the north. And they would tell the people that lived in the north, but they couldn't tell that officially, because you couldn't write anything, or you couldn't call on the phone. There were not that many phones in those days. It was all in secret. They would communicate to people in the north, and they would be looking for places where to hide these Jews, these people. And they decided to place these children, if they were blonde, to the north, and they would say to the people working it all out, to the people working in the underground, we have 5 pounds of tea for you. And the tea meant they had 5 children that were blonde that they were going to send to the north. And if you were being sent to the south, they might say, I have 10 pounds of coffee. And the coffee, of course, was the dark-haired. And the dark-haired children were all sent to the south, because that's where the people were darker. So I was in the train with some children, and every so often the train would stop and people would go out and they would leave a child with a family waiting outside of the train. And this was all worked out by the resistance workers. Eventually, we came to the south of the country of Holland. And when we came to a station, there were 2 soldiers waiting for me. But those soldiers were really just resistance workers that pretended to be Nazis or Nazi sympathizers, and they were not that. They came, picked me up, and they brought me to a house. So it was in the south of the country, in a town called Horst, and they had prearranged it and they brought me to a farm. And on the farm, there was a mother and a father and 3 children. The children were not children. The son was 17, and the 2 daughters, one was 19 and one was about 21. They were all Christian people, Catholic, and they had been going to church all the time. And the priests were involved in all this too, because it took a lot of work to place people and children, because all this was done illegally. There were soldiers all over the place. So the priest one Sunday morning said, we have a lot of children that need to be placed. Are there any people here that are willing to accept a child or would like a child? And my future family, where I stayed eventually, said yes, they would like to have a little girl. Could they arrange that for them? And sure enough, that's how I ended up with the family. The family was called Christians, and I used to call them Oom and Tante, which in Dutch means uncle and aunt. I went to, after those soldiers that picked me up from the station brought me to the farmhouse, and I have a picture here of the farmhouse. And you can see here a picture of the farmhouse, the road in front of the farmhouse, and that cabinet. That cabinet is important in the story, but I'll tell you. So I went there. In the beginning, of course, I was scared. My clothes was all torn. I had holes all over. My body was full of sores. I was a mess. I didn't have anything. And in the beginning, I was scared, but I already had been so traumatized that I accepted everything. And after a few days or weeks, I started liking where I was living, and they were super good to me, the people. And I started feeling at home, and little by little, I forgot where I came from. I started talking the way they talked in the country where the farm was, and I started being happy there. It was a house that was far away from any others, and I stayed mostly in the house or in the back. It was a farm, so you had a house on one side, you had some animals. It was not a big farm like what you would find here, and they grew their own crops. And there were soldiers all around, and there was airplanes flying, and once in a while a bomb would fall nearby. But as long as they don't fall on your own house, it's okay. But we always had food and everything was good. But the family where I was staying with, they said to me, you know, it could happen that one day someone will find out that you live here and you're not allowed to. By that time, I knew that I had to be good and quiet, and I knew that I was not like others, that I was on the run and I was illegal there. So one day, my family comes to me and says, oh, we heard that someone is going to come to the house and they're looking for you. Now that cabinet that you just saw on that picture was standing in those days in the corner of their living room. And they had prepared it all for me and talked to me about it. And they had put a case in back of the cabinet, And because if I would stand there and you would see my little feet and my little shoes, and if they came to look all over, they would see me. So they moved it away. It was a crate. And they said, no, you stand there, and they put the cabinet back so you couldn't see anything. And they said, and don't make a sound, don't make a word. And pretty soon there was knocking at the door and yelling, a lot of screaming and yelling. And I was all this time standing in back of this cabinet, not a sound from me. I was pretty good. I knew already what I was supposed to do. And they screamed and they said, we know you have someone Jewish here. You better show us who this person is. They had no idea. And they started screaming, and they had guns, and they put a gun to the head of my family. And they started walking up the stairs, up on the attic they went, and I was all the time quiet in back of the cabinet. And they went down there, and then they up, and then eventually they went down into the basement, and they went all through the house. It was not that big of a house. But, and then they came also to the room, which was the living room where I was, and the screaming kept on going, and they kept saying, you know, you're making a big mistake, they said to the family. You better tell us where this person is, because you're going to lose your own house and your family won't have a place to live. And that will be the end of it. Do you want that to happen to your family? But they didn't speak and I didn't speak. And this yelling went on, and eventually they went to the door and the screaming continued, but they left. Now I stayed there, didn't do anything, but then after about 10 minutes, I suppose, they came, they moved the cabinet, and they said, oh, you were so good, and they hugged me, and everything was good. And the war continued, but as long as you are with people that you know they love you and take care of you, nothing can happen, right? And there were other incidents that helped. For a while, we had to live in a bunker because there were so many airplanes flying around. But the war ended there at the end of 1944 in the south of the country. My mother, meanwhile, had escaped to Switzerland, and which is a country with mountains. She made it there. And as soon as the war ended in May 1945, and it was very difficult because there was no transportation, everything was messed up. She came back to Holland, found my aunt and my sister. My aunt had known all the time where my sister was. And she came and she was so happy to return. And she hugged my little sister and my aunt and uncle. And she said, yeah, but there's something wrong here. Where's my little girl? And they said, my aunt said to her, you know, we looked for her all over, but couldn't find her. And my mother said, well, what do I do now? And my aunt said, you know what? She herself worked. My aunt worked at, this is a picture of myself. That picture you see, the top and the bottom is my aunt, the one that lived in my hiding place, or the family that lived. So my mother said, well, what do I do now? So then my real aunt said to my mother, you know what? Why don't you put that picture you have of Leni, which was my name at the time, in the paper? Maybe someone will recognize and tell where she is. My mother did, but there were thousands of people that were looking, and there were lots of pictures. She didn't find anything. So my mother said, well, what do I do now? I don't know anything. She might be alive, she might not be. So then, because my hair, they went to a resistance, one of those people that worked in the resistance during the war. They showed them my picture, and she said, my mother said, I lost my daughter. How can I find her? And they looked at the picture and they saw that I was Black and how I looked. They said, oh, she must have surely gone to the south of the country. So we'll see what we can do. So they sent her to an address in the south, and my mother went there, and she showed the lady my picture, and the woman looked at the picture and she said, "Oh, lady, don't worry about it. I know exactly where she is. She's fine. I know exactly where she is. I'll give you the address." So they gave her the address. She came to the house, to the farmhouse, where I was, by that time, war had ended, and I was able to play now with neighbor children. But I was happy, and there comes this lady that says she's your mother. And my hiding parents said, "Oh, this is your mother." And I said, "But I don't want any mother. I just want to stay where I am. I'm happy here. I don't want to leave here." And I sort of hid behind the skirt of my hiding mother. And my mother was smart, and she stayed at the house, and she sort of played with me and made the best of it. But after 2-3 days, my hiding aunt said to me, "You have to go to Amsterdam with your mother. You belong to her." And I didn't want to, but I went, being that I was good, right? So I went to the city, met my sister and the rest of the family that had survived. And I was there, and I started going to school, but my mother had lots of problems with me because I didn't want to be there. And I was crying every day. You had to walk to the school to go by canals. I would be vomiting in the water of the canal, and I was crying all the time. So my mother, I didn't know that, but she went and wrote a letter to my hiding family. In those days, especially in the south where I lived there, we didn't have a telephone. They didn't even have a regular kitchen or bathroom. It was like an outhouse. Everything was primitive, but not because of the war. It was just that it was not the big city, and the modern civilization hadn't come there yet. So one day, my mother had written the family, and one day I came home from school, and there were my 2 hiding sisters, and I was super happy to see them. And they said to me, "Would you like to come back and live with us for a while?" And of course I said yes. And they took me back to the farm, and I was as happy as can be. And I started going to school there, and I was happy. But then I think a couple of months later, my hiding family said to me, "We love having you here, but you cannot stay. You have to go back to your mother." And I had no choice but to go. So I went. They made a deal with me that I would go back to my mother, but any vacation or big holiday, I would stay with them. And we did that. Meanwhile, my mother had remarried. I had a little brother, and I went by that time together with my sister. I got along with my sister, and we would go every vacation, like promised, to the farm. But eventually my new stepfather and mother, they said, "No, we have to go. We're going to immigrate to Argentina." And when you're a child, you don't have a choice what you're going to do or where you're going to live. So I went with my mother and family went first to Argentina. We left a year later, my sister, myself, we went to Argentina and were there and started going. Of course, I went to Argentina. In Argentina, they speak Spanish, and I didn't speak any Spanish. The only language that I could speak was Dutch. So we were there and lived there for 5 years with my brother, my stepfather, mother. I was getting used to school in Argentina. When you're that age, you learn a new language pretty easy, pretty fast. But unfortunately, 5 years later, one day, for other reasons, we had to move to Brazil with my mother. My mother had divorced and had a new husband, and we went to Brazil. Brazil, they speak another language, they speak Portuguese. So we had to start all over speaking Portuguese. And eventually, by then by the end of my 3 years in Brazil, I was about 18, and an old family friend of ours came to visit us in Brazil. And he, at that time, was in his mid-20s, had emigrated to the United States and had been in the US Army in Korea. And on his way back, when he returned from serving, he had come to visit us in Brazil. We fell in love, and a year later, I came to the United States, and we got married here, and I live now in Encino, here in the Valley. And I've lived here ever since, and I'm very happy. And my family, my hiding family, I'm still in touch with my hiding family. The hiding family, meanwhile, have of course died. And the daughter and the son that they had, daughters and son, have also died. But after all these years, I'm still close to the third generation. So those are the grandchildren of my hiding family. And I'm still in touch with them, talk to them occasionally. And they mean the world for me. And also, if, like in the case of my hiding family, the government of Israel has made a new award, or an award that they give people that were taking Jews during the war, that saved them from the Germans. They gave them special awards. And I had to apply for that. The person that wants those families to receive it have to apply. And they do extensive work and make sure that there is no fraud. So they received a special award. And I think I should let you speak a little bit, ask some questions to give you some time. That's my story. And I hope that, that you will be upstanding citizens too. There's a lot that a regular person can do to help those around you. I would not have been saved if it hadn't been for those people that put their own life at risk. And it wasn't only the farm people, it was all those people during my journey that I had from Amsterdam, from the north of the country to the south. There must have been lots of people that were involved in saving Jews. So thank you for listening, and I'll open it up to you to ask me questions now.
When did you learn English? Actually,
the first time I started learning English was in Argentina. My mother had sent us, they offered some courses where you could learn English. So I spoke a little bit here and there. And then in Brazil, it was the same thing. And don't forget that by then already, that American culture had such a big influence all over the world. So you listen to all these pop songs, Frank Sinatra, all these famous movies. So you would be used to hearing English, but I really didn't. When I came to America, and that was in 1958, I spoke English, but worse than now. But, when you live someplace and you get used to it, you learn. But I had been speaking somewhat in Argentina and more in Brazil.
Do you ever worry that this could happen again?
After the years, after the war, and when I first started speaking, I thought, okay, we have to do this. It's really important that people know what's going to happen. But now with what's happening in the world, and then when you see what's happening in Ukraine, I think that life is so fragile that anything is possible. I never thought that it would be happy. And most of all, I think we have to depend on people like you students. You are the future, and help be an upstanding citizen and help.
You said you learned Spanish. Can you say a few words?
Sí, no sé lo que tengo que hablar con ustedes. Mi español, yo tengo un acento, pero también es muy diferente de la manera que la gente habla en México, en América Central. En Argentina es más como lo hablan un poco diferente y lo dicen castellano en vez de español.
How many languages do you speak?
I don't know. I understand more than what I speak. My sister, who is still alive, and she is going to be here visiting me after 3 years of the pandemic. But I do understand Italian and French and German more, because German is sort of similar to Dutch, and of course, Portuguese and Spanish.
Well, I think the schools the school district would like to say a few words.
Sure.
Yeah, okay. Well, I just want to say there was a teacher who said, my children's grandparents are survivors. And I cannot stress how important it is for our family, for people to hear the survivor stories.
Oh, I might want to tell you that we do have in Los Angeles, we started that quite some years ago. We didn't know it at the time. We really didn't think as child survivors. When the war ended, we did not think that we were such a big deal. It was more only, we thought that only the adults that had been in concentration camps, those were the real survivors. We were not. But of course, we changed our minds since then. And we formed a group of survivors here in Los Angeles. And we do have a book that we published of our stories of the child. We became a group of child survivors. And we do have pictures and events at both museums of the Holocaust and the Wiesenthal Center. And I have wonderful friends that I met here in Los Angeles. We were the first group, I think, in the world that started a group of child survivors. We're still in existence. We do have events that we do together.